In 1980, a man snapped a photograph, and then he snatched up the children, and he was gone, leaving their mother in total despair. But later, a woman would look carefully at that photograph, and she would see something that no one else could. Harding Township, New Jersey, was, for the most part, a quiet place that seemed to be immune to chaos. It was a patchwork of wooded lots, modest homes, and old stone walls. It wasn't the type of town where people feared abductions or vanishing children. Deborah and Joe Keyes had raised their 3 kids, Diane, Jean, and John, within this calm landscape. Like so many couples, they had struggled, grown distant, and then eventually divorced. But even the divorce proceedings began with an era of ordinary difficulty, the kind where neighbors talk about it only in hushed, sympathetic tones. By June of 1980, Deborah had been awarded full custody of the children and the house. Well, to ease this transition, a judge granted Joe one final week with the kids in the family home, and everything went according to plan for the first 6 days. But on the 7th, well, the house fell silent, and Joe and the children were gone. Deborah's terror, of course, was immediate. She dialed everyone that she could think of, her family, Joe's relatives, friends, neighbors, co-workers, hoping that someone had seen something. Unfortunately, no one had. By the time that she called the police, she was shaking. Officers arrived, scanned the house, searched the property, and they quickly realized that this was no misunderstanding. Joe had taken the children and disappeared with intention. Investigators began the hunt. They traced credit card transactions, phoned relatives, and combed through possible routes. Each time that they got close, however, Joe slipped away, leaving behind no more than a faint paper trail and secondhand sightings. Well, days blurred into weeks, and then the weeks turned into months. The longer that the children remained missing, the more fear replaced hope. Detective Lou Masterbone, I know, interesting name, isn't it? True character in this case, though, true name. Anyway, he was one of the detectives of the Morris County Police Department, and he took the case. Experienced, methodical, and stubbornly committed, he followed every lead that he could, but the trail just kept breaking apart. Parental abduction laws at the time were new, and they were inconsistently enforced, especially across state lines. States didn't always cooperate with formal reciprocity, and Joe could effectively outrun the system just by jumping from home to home soon enough. Well, as the months turned into a half a year, Deborah grew desperate enough, in fact, to consider an option that the rest of us would think is downright crazy. She had heard, through her mother, there is this psychic named Nancy Weber. Deborah didn't necessarily believe in psychics, but she knew one thing for sure. The authorities didn't seem like they were any closer now than when they had started, so she decided that she would give it a try. It was around 8:30 in the evening when she called Nancy. Her voice was trembling as she shared what had happened: the divorce, the judge's ruling, her husband's last visit with the children, and then, of course, the vanishing. One of the very first things that Nancy said was, "Please, don't tell me any more about this crime. I don't want to know anything else about what happened. I want to look at this case my way, without being tainted by any investigative clues or physical evidence." And then she asked Deborah if she had a photo of the children, and she said that she would like her to bring it, and then they set up a time to meet. And then Deborah asked her, "Well, how much are you going to charge?" And right then and there, the skeptic in me said, "Aha! That's what this is all about, isn't it? The money, the con pretending to be able to see something that the rest of us just can't. And it'll only cost you ... X amount of money." Well, Nancy's answer was surprising.
"There will be no charge for any of my services."
That was actually Nancy's voice that you just heard. We usually use voice actors for these types of quotes, but she agreed to come on our show and speak her own quotes. So that quote, and the rest of the quotes that she'll be saying in this video, are exactly what she said back then. Well, of course, as best as she can remember. Basically, she had told Deborah that by the time this is all over with, Deborah was going to be so far in debt, and Nancy wasn't about to add to her burdens, hence the no charge for her services. Her answer was all that much more profound when one discovers that at that time, Nancy was going through her own personal crisis. She herself was facing a custody battle. Although her husband hadn't stolen her child, he was being relentless, and the court costs were mounting. Nancy definitely could have used the extra money. And to make matters worse, and perhaps a deeper motivator as to why she decided not to charge for this case, was the absolute horror that Nancy had went through with this man. Many years ago, before she had decided to become a psychic detective, he had tried to kill her and her unborn child.
Welcome to Velarcana. Here, we share mysteries that often defy explanation. I research the cases, and my husband tells the stories.
To understand the weight of Nancy's involvement in this particular case, I think it's important that we understand the person behind the title, psychic. Nancy's life had not been one of gentle intuition or spiritual quietness. No, not at all. It had been a roller coaster of one tragedy after another. In her 20s, she had been attacked by an intruder in her own home. And I definitely don't want to jinx this video and confuse the YouTube gods by sharing the exact nature of the crime that this man committed. YouTube frowns on certain topics, no matter how benign we try to make them. But he was a man, and she was a woman, and this was a horrific crime, and I'm sure that you can figure out what happened from there. Well, as you can imagine, this event was traumatizing, and it left Nancy shaken, but determined to rebuild. So, seeking safety, she turned to a physician that she trusted, Dr. Gilbert Arnold Preston, and theirs was a whirlwind romance, full of happiness, love, and connection. So, within a few months, they were married and living in beautiful Puerto Rico. Unfortunately for Nancy, tragedy would strike again. She soon discovered, and this is horrible, that the man whom she loved, the man whom she had run to for shelter and trusted for safety, had a hidden side to him. A dark, twisted side that most of us only hear about or watch on our favorite true crime shows. And there were times where she had to walk on eggshells and be very, very careful with what she said. And sometimes even that wasn't good enough. Well, it all accumulated one day when she found herself pregnant and terrified and on the very edge of passing out. He was 6'3" and she was 5'7", and he had his ginormous hands wrapped around her tiny little neck, and he was squeezing the very life out of her and watching the light as it slowly faded from her eyes.
I knew I had only minutes to live, at most. I knew I was dying. I couldn't breathe. I told myself to sink. Go limp. Protect my baby.
As her consciousness was fading, she did something that I don't know if I could do. She resisted the urge to fight. She forced every muscle in her body to relax. And just a few seconds after she did that, his hands widened, letting her neck slip through, and she fell limp to the floor. Thinking that he had finished the job, he went into the kitchen, and Nancy was afraid to open her eyes. So she stayed on the floor, quiet, hoping that the monster who she married hadn't injured her baby.
I don't know how much time passed before I opened my eyes enough to see him drinking something while standing by the sink. He seemed calm, believing he just killed me.
Intense, isn't it? Well, as she laid there on the floor, something came over her, something that told her that she was no longer going to be one of life's victims. And she found herself getting up off of the floor and then moving toward this man. It was a very tense moment as he stood by the sink with his back to her, and she just steadily kept taking one step after another toward the man who had just tried and thought that he had actually killed her. I gotta tell you, as Nancy was telling Amy and I about this part, I remember thinking, wow, just how brave does a person have to be, right? I also remember thinking that it was amazing that he hadn't just spun around and then finished the job. But of course, that's not what happened. As if all of the power of the universe was standing right behind Nancy, he turned around and his eyes widened in disbelief. Well, she got right up in his face and was just inches away, and then she suggested that he be very careful whenever he sleeps.
If you ever touch me again, there will be a knife in your heart.
Nancy said that she was shocked at her own words, but she knew that she meant every single one of them. She walked away empowered, and that moment was transformative, and something beyond survival became part of Nancy's identity that day. Although Nancy has always been psychic, the moment that she stood up against being harmed, her power became sharper and more focused.
That day, I became a warrior to help myself and others in need.
Well, Nancy left Dr. Jekyll, divorced him and moved on, and then started using her psychic abilities to help others. And now, years later, she was facing yet another battle, a looming custody fight over their daughter, Rebecca. Dr. Preston had become a well-respected, influential physician who had hired a high-powered attorney, one who specialized in winning custody battles for men. With the court date quickly approaching, Nancy felt her past resurfacing, threatening to take away the most important thing in her life, her daughter. It was in this fragile emotional landscape that Deborah's phone call reached her. And so, when Nancy agreed to help, it wasn't only for Deborah. It was for every woman who had ever been in this type of situation. It was for every moment in Nancy's own life when she had felt attacked and powerless to respond.
How could I charge her? I could be next. My daughter's father was suing me for custody. His threats of abduction weren't far from my mind. He tried to snatch my daughter just to hurt me. Deborah's story was far too close for comfort.
The ladies hung up, and a few days later, Deborah arrived at Nancy's home with a photograph of her children. 3 beautiful faces smiling, frozen in a moment of happiness just before everything went wrong. Well, Nancy held the photo, and according to her, the first sensation that came was simple and unexpected. There was a breath of fresh air. The children were going to come home. But she also sensed that it wasn't going to be easy, and it was going to take quite a bit of time. Well, Deborah asked if she could return with one of the sheriff's investigators. So a few days later, she arrived with Detective Masterbone. He was a grounded man who wasn't at all a believer in any of this silly psychic nonsense. But during their first meeting, Nancy would share some things with him that would completely blow his mind. Investigator Masterbone was polite, but he was skeptical. Psychic work wasn't his jam. But with leads exhausted, and with the months slipping away, he agreed that he would sit down with Nancy and see if anything useful emerged. But as they were making their way up the stairs to her office, he made it absolutely clear how he felt.
I called 2 other police officers, Bill Hughes and Ross English, for references. They said they worked with you and told me you were good. I just want you to know I still did not believe all this. I'm only here because Deborah needs support and asked me to come.
This time, Deborah came with more than just a photograph. She brought shoes, shirts, and other things that their little hands had touched. Nancy claimed that it would all help, and the 3 of them sat down for the next several hours. And during that time, Nancy seen flashes in her mind, like they were scenes from a movie.
The first thing I saw was a map of Texas and felt a connection between the map, the children, and Joe.
Joe, again, was the children's father. He was the one who had abducted them. Well, Nancy opened her eyes, and then she went and retrieved an encyclopedia, and then she opened it to a map of Texas.
Sometimes it simply feels like my attention is drawn to it, whatever it is, like a magnet pulling on me.
And there it was. Euless, Texas. Nancy felt energized when she said the name out loud. And, check this out, so did skeptic Detective Masterbone. But not because he had been zapped with some mysterious psychic power. No, it was because out of all of the places in all of the world, Nancy had somehow zeroed in on Euless, Texas. And there was no way that she could have known that just a short time earlier, the investigation had led Detective Masterbone to that very town. The children's school records had placed them there in Euless, Texas, months earlier. But when investigators arrived, well, the family had already left. This information was in case notes only and had not been made available to the public, so there was no way that Nancy could have known this. Well, Nancy continued and appeared to get too specific for someone who was just taking random guesses. She described glimpses of the children's experiences, clothing that was just a little bit too tight, a dog bite that would leave stitches just above Jean's lip, a house where Joe had grown increasingly religious in a fearful, frantic sort of a way. And then she started talking about seeing snow-capped mountains, but warm air, and the ocean not being too far away. And then it all snapped into place. They were somewhere in California. E. She kept seeing the letter E. E Street. They're on E Street. Detective Masterbone told her that California is vast, and a single letter was no help at all. Well, Nancy struggled, but she was unable to provide what she did not see. And then, at one point, as she was pushing her thoughts as far as she could, it was as if the universe gave her an unexpected nudge from the outside. Her dog, Ramona, stirred from sleep. Well, Nancy broke her concentration and focused on the dog for just a second. Quiet, Ramona. And the moment that she said the dog's name out loud, the thought solidified. She said, Ramona. That's it, Ramona, California. The children are on E Street in Ramona, California. Interestingly, even while she spoke those words, she wasn't even sure that there was a town called Ramona in California. But the universe often works in mysterious ways. Well, along with this information, Nancy also described something else, something that would become the key to breaking this case wide open. And it wasn't a vision of a place. No, it was a vision of a desk and a stack of checks and a person who nobody would have expected to help. Nancy sat across from Detective Masterbone, and he watched her as she was lost in vision.
I see checks his mother wrote to him. The canceled checks are lying on her desk. They are the key to finding him.
Nancy said that she was certain that if asked, the woman would turn those checks over to the police in order to help the investigation. Well, Detective Masterbone seriously doubted that. He had already spoken to Joe's mother several times, and she showed no willingness to cooperate. Still, he made the note. Early the next morning, he phoned the San Diego County Police to check on Ramona, California, but they didn't respond with any urgency. Back then, parental abduction cases were a pretty low priority, especially from out of state, so he tried the canceled check angle. A lawyer issued a subpoena for Joe's mother to bring all financial documents related to her son to the station. Among them, lo and behold, were canceled checks, just as Nancy had described. No address for Joe, though, but stamped on the back of the checks was the name of a bank. The bank was in the town of, yep, you guessed it, Ramona, California. While Masterbone's disbelief grew, could Nancy have guessed correctly twice? No. Still, the coincidence was crazy. Well, he contacted California police again, this time with the bank address. But the process was painstakingly slow. The days dragged by and then turned into weeks. But eventually, authorities did obtain an address for Joe. Now, are you ready for this? The address was 1225 E Street, Ramona, California. That's crazy, right? Well, the detective told Deborah right away. She was thrilled, and she called Nancy excited that she was going to be seeing her children again real soon. But Nancy had bad news. Nancy said that she was sorry, but she didn't see it. She didn't know why, but there was going to be a delay. Nancy knew that if the authorities didn't go right then, if they waited even one more day, it would be too late.
Everything inside me wanted to shout at the police, "Go now!"
Sadly, the next day she was proven correct. California authorities arrived at Joe's last known address, but the house was empty. He had left just the day before. Well, Deborah felt crushed. With another lead gone, another place where the children had been, but no longer were. But then came a break. As police were talking to neighbors, one of them provided a forwarding address, Honolulu, Hawaii. Well, Deborah filled up with panic. If Joe could take the kids all the way to Hawaii, well, then he could cross oceans and he could vanish into a larger world and she would never see her children again. Well, she shared her concerns with Nancy, but Nancy sensed something different this time. She told Deborah that after all of this running and chasing, something inside of Joe had changed and that the children had become too much for him to manage alone. According to Nancy, his soul was tired, and somewhere deep inside of him, he knew that it was time to stop. Nancy told her that she would see her children this Friday at exactly 4 p.m. Nancy had had a vision that she would meet her children underneath an arch. Well, in Honolulu, police located Joe before he could move again. He was taken into custody overnight. The children, confused and frightened, were brought to a youth holding center, and they were held there until their mother could arrive. Deborah entered the facility the next afternoon. She stood facing an archway, surrounded entry with a clock suspended just above it. Well, she glanced at the time. It was 3:59 p.m., and just as the second hand swept forward, 3 beautiful children stepped into view, walking beneath the arch as if the moment had been deliberately choreographed. And it was exactly 4 p.m. when they all reached their mother. 14 months after they had vanished, Diane, Jean, and John were finally home. What followed felt almost surreal. The children were in generally good health. Their clothing, investigators confirmed, was indeed too small, too tight. Jean had these stitches just above her upper lip from a dog bite, just as Nancy had described. Detective Masterbone later told Nancy that without that canceled check clue, he never would have pursued Joe's mother, and he would never have discovered that bank stamp on the back leading to Ramona, California, which of course led to Hawaii. It was the very hinge the entire case had turned on. For Deborah, the nightmare had ended, but for Nancy, one more battle remained: her custody trial. Well, the following month, she entered the courtroom prepared for the worst, but she drew a breath of fresh air when she discovered that the case had been dropped. Nancy's long fight for Deborah, for her daughter, for herself, was finally over. Yet this case leaves a lingering question that we have to dive into, one that investigators, skeptics, and believers continue to wrestle with. How much of Nancy's information was genuine, otherworldly insight, and how much of it was coincidence, guesses, or just the subconscious stitching together of hidden clues? This case, like so many of the others that Amy and I have done, sits in a strange place, somewhere between documented history and the shadows of human perception. The events themselves are undisputed. 3 children abducted by their father, moved from state to state, and then located after 14 excruciating months. Police records confirm the timeline. Legal documents confirm the custody battle. Newspaper archives detail the abduction and the recovery. But what remains open to interpretation, of course, is Nancy Weber's role in all of this. Was she tapping into something beyond ordinary senses? Or was she perhaps, consciously or not, somehow piecing together information from Deborah's tone, the detective's reactions, or subtle context clues? Even Detective Masterbone struggled to understand it. He had walked in a skeptic, and he left with evidence that he just couldn't dismiss. Euless, Texas, Ramona, California, E Street, the canceled checks, the dog bite, the stitches. Too many details had matched, yet even he, perhaps stubbornly, never fully committed to the supernatural explanation. Instead, he framed the experience the only way that a seasoned detective really can. Whatever Nancy did, it helped. And sometimes, in the long grinding machinery of missing persons cases, a little help is all that really matters, right? For Deborah, the truth didn't need a label. No, the truth walked toward her in the form of 3 precious souls beneath a Hawaiian archway at exactly 4 p.m. And as for Nancy, well, her life continued, marked by the strange intersection of trauma, intuition, and a sense of purpose. With her own custody battle resolved, she dove deeply into her own work, But of course, she was forever shaped by the case that had mirrored her fears and tested her abilities. And with all mysteries rooted in human perception, what remains is not a definite answer, but rather a question that lingers in the quiet moments. That question is this: how much of what we call intuition is instinct, and how much of it is something else entirely? Perhaps the boundary between the known and the unknown is just a little bit thinner than we all imagine. Perhaps some people are just tuning in to what the rest of us deliberately overlook. Or perhaps the universe, in rare moments of desperation, allows the right set of eyes to see just far enough beyond the veil. In the end, this case leaves us with a paradox, one where documents and vision overlap, facts and feelings tangle, and the truth, of course, stands somewhere in the middle, just outside of our grasp. A mystery solved, yet still profoundly mysterious.
I really enjoyed researching this one because we had the pleasure of working with Nancy. She's super sweet and genuine, and I believe that she is the real deal. You know, this story reminds me a little of what happened to Gabby Villanova. Her children weren't taken. No, they were being tormented and in their own home. Supposedly, an evil force had gotten into their house and was terrorizing everyone. And the interesting thing about this case was who they reached out to for help. It was a New York City police sergeant who moonlighted as an exorcist. Theirs is a crazy story, and we did a complete mystery on it. If you'd like to see it, it's here.